Welcome to my Rome Total War setup guide. I played a campaign as the Seleucid Empire this year, and I had no crashes, so I decided I would create a video explaining how I set up my Rome Total War install. This is the long version of the guide, so I'm going to explain both how I set it up and why. It does mean that the video is going to be rather lengthy, so if you only want to see the how I set it up and don't really care to hear why I set things up the way I did, you can go ahead and watch the short version to just get you up and running as quickly as possible. If I'm going too fast in this video, then feel free to pause, slow me down, or if you think I'm going too slowly, you could even speed me up using YouTube's controls. Something I forgot to mention in the short guide is that there will also be chapter markers down below so you can skip ahead, go back, or if you just want to skip over a section. And so without further delay, let's begin. So first we're going to need to install Rome Total War. For this guide, I will be using the Steam version throughout, and I believe most of what I'm going to do here is going to apply to the disc version. Some steps might be different, but at least for this guide, we will be using the Steam version. If you do use the guide for the disc version, let me know how it went in the comments down below. So first, let's just go ahead and install. If you have multiple Steam libraries, select the one you want it to go to and click Install. Once the game is finished installing, let's go ahead and right-click on Rome Total War and go to Properties. Now your Steam overlay may be on, it may be off, but regardless, turn it off if it's on. We're going to be using some software that have their own overlays later in the guide, and I just don't like having any extra overlays running, especially if I'm not really using them for anything. Next, we're going to want to put in two launch options, -NE, and then hit space and put in -show_ERR. Now I'm going to demonstrate what these do later, but in brief, -NE is a borderless windowed mode, and -show_ERR, basically the game will show you some additional errors if it crashes or if something happens. I don't think it'll show you an error every time a crash happens or if there's an error, but you'll see more than you otherwise would. And that definitely helps when it comes to troubleshooting. And so with that done, let's go ahead and load the game. Just hit play and leave it at the default. We'll talk about Barbarian Invasion later in the guide. Once the game is loaded, you may notice it is not taking up the entirety of my screen. Now that's because the default resolution is actually much smaller than my monitor's resolution. So let's go ahead and fix that first. If we go into Options and then Video Settings, you can see we have our strategy and battle map resolutions here at the top. Now there is a problem though, because if I click on this and then scroll all the way down, I actually do not have my resolution available. My monitor's resolution is 2560 by 1440. So what am I to do? Well, it looks like I'll have to actually go into the Preferences file and change it there. So let's exit out of the game. Once you've exited the game, just right-click on Rome Total War, go to Manage, and then Browse Local Files. Now in this Preferences folder here, there should be a file, either Preferences or Preferences.txt. It should open in just a notepad. Now if I scroll down here, you can actually see there's Strategy Resolution and Max Resolution here, and Battle Resolution and Battle Max Resolution there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change all four of these to be my monitor's resolution. With that changed, I'm going to go ahead and save the file and close out of it. We can close out of that window too, and let's get back into the game. And as you can see, now that I've fired up the game again, the game is now full screen. And if I go back to my video settings, you can see I now have 2560 by 1440 in both the battle map and the strategy map resolution. Now, under the Show Advanced Options, you can change most of these to be exactly as you like. In my case, I usually put all of them on, if they're the checkboxes down below, and set all of these to be as high as they can go. There are two exceptions, which I will show you in a moment once I've changed all of these settings to what I usually like them to be. All right, and with all my settings set up, you can see that there are two options here that are not at the highest possible setting. One is anti-aliasing, which is completely turned off. Now that's because I am using Reshade, or will use Reshade, and we'll cover that later in the guide. But since Reshade will be handling anti-aliasing, I usually turn off the in-game one. The other option is the unit detail, which as you can see is at high instead of highest. You can actually use whichever one of these you want except for highest. And that's actually worth an explanation in itself, because if you do put it as high as it can go, you're going to have some terrible frame rate regardless of how good your computer is. To demonstrate just how big of a problem that is, I've actually loaded in a custom battle here. Now, I am using RivaTuner statistics server to give us a frame counter up here in the top right. However, I am not limiting my frames in any way. Vsync is not turned on, so that is just the frames we are getting. I have also loaded in a typical Seleucid Empire army, or typical for the campaign that I went through earlier this year. Now, if I'm staring at just a blank field here, you can see my frames are actually pretty good. 54, 55 frames per second. That's actually quite good. But now, what happens if I turn around and face my army? And my poor frames dropped right down to 27 frames per second. And remember, I haven't even loaded in the enemy army yet. I'm just staring at my own troops. And as I move the camera around here, ducking it in amongst them, or just moving it far away like this even, again, the frames are just not very good. It seems like I only get my best frames when I look away from them, and it goes back up to 55. Now, of course, that's with the unit detail set to the highest setting it could possibly go. Let's do this again. But this time, let's have it set to high instead of highest. All right, so here we are again. The exact same custom battle, the same field, the same army, the same everything, except for unit detail has been switched from highest to high. Now, staring at a blank grassy field, once again, we are getting 54, 55 frames per second. So now what happens if I turn around and face my army? And the answer is essentially nothing. I am still getting 54, 55 frames per second. Now, your camera will often be high up when you're directing a battlefield, but there are times where you might want to dive your camera down in amongst your troops. So I'm actually going to put my camera right between these two pikeman units here. And we'll see what the results are. Right about there, we've got a bit of that unit in view, and of course the rest of the army in view here. And as you can see, the frames have actually dropped quite a bit. Looks like between 33 and, I want to say, I think at one point it jumped up to 37 frames per second there. Now that's not terrible. Remember before with the other test, we were getting 27 frames per second just looking at the entirety of the army. But of course, we do want that to be as high as it can go, but we're not actually going to come back to this until a little later in the guide. But just remember these numbers here. Basically, between 33 and let's say 37 frames per second when you've dived the camera down amongst your own troops. All right, and now with that explanation out of the way and all of your in-game preferences set the way you want, let's go ahead and go back to the control settings. It is worth taking a quick look at them. As you see, Rome Total War comes from a time when camera controls were tied to arrow keys instead of to W, A, S, and D. So you can see left, right, up, and down, and everything is in there. So it is worth coming in here and changing them to whatever you want them to be. And here we go. There's all the keys set up the way that I set them up. Now that actually takes care of all of the in-game settings and all the in-game preferences. There actually are some more preferences available in that preferences file that we were looking at earlier. So let's go back to that really quick. Now to get back to that preferences file, it's the same as before. Just right-click on Rome Total War, go to Manage, Browse Local Files. Inside of this Preferences folder here, you'll have that preferences file there, which you can open in a notepad. Now, all of the preferences that are set in-game are actually in this file, except for the control settings, which are in a separate file. It's actually the keys.dat file that you see there. But all of like the resolution, the unit detail, and all that is in here. But there's also some options that are in here that are not in-game. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure how important some of them are to the stability of the game. If you look at the very top of the file here, you can see there's a safe refresh option that I've got set to true, but I'm pretty sure I've always had that set to true, so I don't know if that would cause any problems if it was set to false. The same thing with like the use triple buffer option that you see down here. I'm pretty sure I've always had that set to true. I don't remember ever having that set to false, so it might be worth looking through this if you're having issues and seeing if you want to experiment with some of these. I'll leave a link to a copy of this preferences file in the description down below, so you can just download that and look at it there if you want. There are also definitely some options in here that don't really have anything to do with the stability of the game. For example, there's a show banners option right here that I've set to false. That's why when we were doing our custom battle before, there were no banners above the units. I just prefer not to have that enabled. And that's an option that isn't in the game, so you would have to come here if you wanted to set that to false. I think it's also worth mentioning that whether or not you were looking at the preferences file here, or if you were looking at the settings in-game, you may have noticed that there was no Vsync option, and indeed there was no options to limit your frame rate at all. I did mention that I have RivaTuner statistics server, and I do use that when I want to limit my frames. In brief, if you do have RivaTuner statistics server installed, you can actually change the frame rate limit right here. I have it set to 0 just because I didn't want to limit my frames while we were conducting those tests earlier. Now, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, you could also use the NVIDIA app utility to limit the frames. I noticed that Rome Total War does not seem to get automatically added to the list on the left here, so you will have to add it. Just click on the 3 dots up here and add a program. And now you need to browse to where you've installed Rome Total War to. If you're not sure where that is, you can actually just go right back to Steam, right-click on Rome Total War, and go to the Browse Local Files option again. And you can see that's the location right up there. Now you can right-click and copy that. Go back to the NVIDIA app and right-click and paste it right in there. Hit Enter on your keyboard, and there's the 2 executables right there. I would actually probably select both of them and make sure the options are the same for both inside of the NVIDIA app. Unless, of course, you have no intention of playing Barbarian Invasion, in which case Rome Total War by itself is probably fine. Now, I believe the option is down here. Yep, it's right here, and currently it's turned off, but you just click on it, turn it on, and then set whatever frame rate limit you want. If, on the other hand, you're still using the old NVIDIA control panel, you just want to click on Manage 3D Settings over here on the left. RomeTotalWar.exe will already be added if you tried this with the app, but if you didn't, or if you don't have NVIDIA app, you would have to click Add and basically do what we did with NVIDIA app and add it to this list here. And if you scroll down, you can see the max frame rate option is right here. Again, just turn it on and set the frame rate to whatever you want it to be. Now, if you're looking for Vsync, it's actually just a little further down, or near the bottom rather. Just click here, choose whichever option you want. To be honest, I haven't ever really used half of these options, so I'm not sure which one is best. Probably just turn it on and that would be fine. In the NVIDIA app, it's actually right there. Again, you get the same kind of options there. Now with RivaTuner, it doesn't have like traditional Vsync. It has this scanline sync mode, which I have never ever used. Again, you can consider it. This is why it's not really part of the guide, because I haven't really used most of these options before, so you'd have to make your own judgment as to which one you would want to use. And of course, if you don't have an NVIDIA graphics card, then these 2 windows here, the NVIDIA control panel and the NVIDIA app, won't apply to you. Your graphics card should have its own control panel with its own options, but I don't have any of those graphics cards, so you'll have to do your own research and your own investigation into that. To be clear, I do think it's probably a good idea to limit your frames in some way, either just by deliberately setting a max frame rate or through using Vsync, but I think we'll talk a bit more about that probably at the end of the guide, because there's a couple of programs, or at least one program there at the end, that actually could affect how you make that decision. Last, but most certainly not least, I did just want to point out that once you've got your controls set the way you want and your preferences set the way you want, you can actually go ahead and copy these files anywhere you want just to keep them as a backup, just so that in the future, if you want to reinstall Rome Total War, you don't have to reset up everything the way you want. You can just copy and paste the backed up files right into this directory here. Now, earlier in this guide, I actually had you guys set a couple of launch options here, but I said I would explain them more in depth later on, and now is that time. The reason I've waited this long is just because I think it's easier to demonstrate once all the preferences are set the way we want. Now, the first of those options was -NE, and I said it would allow you to use borderless windowed mode. Now, I'm going to launch the game without any launch options, just so that I can demonstrate something for you. See, sometimes while I'm in the middle of a game, and some of you may experience this as well, you might need to Alt-Tab out of the game to check on something or just do something else. Now, you can do that without borderless windowed mode turned on. You can just hit Alt-Tab, and as you can see, it brings me right to the Steam window that I had open here. Now, once I click on the game to go back into it, though, you'll notice that there was a bit of a bar down there for just a moment, and the cinematic that's playing in the background here seems to have started over. Now, in the base game, my understanding is that's not necessarily a big issue. I have seen some posts, some thoughts saying that it's far more likely to crash, the game that is, once you come back in after Alt-Tabbing out like that. And to be clear, that bar does appear in the game, the actual game. Like if you go to the campaign map or if you're in the middle of a battle, it is more likely that a crash will occur. Now, to be clear, that's just from like posts and stuff that I've seen. I've always used the -NE option to enable borderless windowed mode, so I've never really experienced that myself. But basically, to show you what exactly that does, basically I just exited out of the game for a moment and put the -NE option back in. So what happens now if I Alt-Tab? Well, at first it's exactly the same. I just go right back to the Steam window again. But now if I click on, or even just hover over the mouse, you can actually see it there. The game is actually continuing to run in the background. It hasn't been paused or, it hasn't been suspended in any way. So if I click on it, it just comes right back to where I was. The cinematic does not reset, there's no bar. And again, this would happen if I was on the campaign map or in the middle of a battle. Basically, it just continues running in the background. Now, the other launch option that we set was that -show_ERR. And to demonstrate what that does, I've actually deliberately messed with one of Rome Total War's files, specifically the file that controls what factions are available to play as. So now the option is not set right now. I've only got that -NE option set right now. So if I back out of the game, what happens? And the answer is nothing. It didn't seem to think that there was any problem with the file and the changes that I had made to it. But there are definitely problems with it. So let's go ahead and add that launch option back to it again. Again, it's show_ERR. I'm going to relaunch the game again. And here we are back at the faction selection screen again. So if I back out and exit the game, what happens? You can see I actually get an error, and it's telling me that there's a problem with this file here, and it even tells me the line and the column there. Now, I don't believe an error will pop up every single time that there's a problem with your game necessarily, but you'll definitely get more windows showing you errors than you otherwise would. So I do think it's a useful troubleshooting tool just to have that option set so you can see what exactly the problem is, assuming the game is able to display it to you. So the next thing we are going to do is set up DXVK. Here's the link that we're going to up in the top left here, but I'll also have that link down below in the description if you want to just click on that instead. Now, DXVK is updated somewhat regularly, so depending on when you see this video, this might not be the latest version. I would go ahead and try the latest version, whatever it is, and only if you experience problems or issues, maybe revert back to an older version. This version here, 2.5.3, is the version that I used for my campaign that I keep mentioning. And just to underscore the point, I'm actually recording this video over a couple of weeks here, and in between the first and second recording sessions, DXVK has actually updated, so now it's on version 2.6. So if you go to that page, this will be the latest one. Unless, of course, you're watching this video even later, in which case it may even be a higher version than that. But the rest of the video will continue using the version 2.5.3. The reason I'm just inserting this here is just because I wanted to point out that it could be updated at any time, and some of them might be relevant bug fixes. Rome Total War does use DirectX 8, so some of this may or may not apply. It may break things, it may make things better. So like I said, just try the latest version that's available to you when you check this page, and if you have any issues, go back to an older version. And just for your reference, 2.5.3 is the version that I used during my campaign. But what you want to do is just scroll down here, this top file here that ends with .tar.gz, not the Steam RT one down here, just this one here. Go ahead and download it by clicking on it. Once it's finished downloading, go ahead and open it up. Now I should mention though that I'm actually using 7-zip. I'm actually not sure if Windows is able to open tar.gz files on its own. If it's not, then you'll have to go ahead and go get 7-zip. Now in 7-zip, when you double click, you just kind of open it up, go in a couple of folders deeper, and you'll find X32 here. Open that one up and you'll have the D3D8 and the D3D9 files. So let's go ahead and extract those. Now they're sitting here right in my downloads folder. Now, where I want them to go, though, is in the Rome Total War folder, basically where we found the Preferences folder earlier. So what I'm going to do is highlight both of those, right-click and cut. And then I'm going to go right-click on Rome Total War in Steam, just as we did earlier, and go to Browse Local Files. And this is the folder right where we want those DLL files to end up. So I'm just going to right-click and paste. Now DXVK is already set up. Now you're probably wondering what DXVK is going to do for us. There's actually two uses for it, one of which is going to be covered much later in this guide, but there is one I would like to demonstrate right now. We're back in that custom battle once again, staring at a blank grassy field, RivaTuner, same army, blah blah blah, you know the drill. Now if you look in the top right, you can already see that there's an interesting improvement with our frames here. The last time we loaded up this custom battle, we were getting 54, 55 frames per second, and now we're getting 63, 64. I thought it jumped up to 65 at some point, but the point is that we seem to be getting more frames than we were before. Now, of course, we're just staring at a blank grassy field right now, so what happens if I turn around and face my army? Looks like it's dropped back down to exactly what it was last time. Well, maybe with one extra frame, because I see it's going from 55 to 56, whereas I think with the last test we were going from 54 to 55, but one extra frame doesn't seem to be much of an improvement. So is DXVK only going to improve things while we're staring at a blank field? That doesn't seem very useful. Where I think DXVK is quite useful is when we dive the camera down in our troops. Now, you may recall during the last test, we aimed for a spot more or less between these two units here, and so I'm going to try and position the camera more or less where it was last time. I think it was kind of like that. Now, the frames we were getting during our last test were between, I think we said 33 and 37. I think a couple of times I did see it drop even lower to like 31 or 32. Let's say it was in the 30s. But I guess regardless of what we decide it was definitely not 50-51. So we actually see quite a dramatic improvement. Not only in the amount of frames we are getting, but also I think in the stability. Because you also may recall that while we were just sitting there staring at the screen, not moving the camera at all, it really was jumping around. It would be 32 1 second, then it would be 37, then it would be 33, then it would be 37 again, and it was just kind of going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But now it's just moving between 50 and 51. So I think not only are we getting more frames per second, but I also think they're a lot more stable. It also is pretty stable when we move the camera around, because before we didn't do this in the last test, but I don't believe it's going to drop below 50 as I move the camera down the line of our units here. And yes, it is going up, but that's because there's now fewer and fewer units on screen. So we're getting back up to that 65 that we were looking at before when we were staring at a blank field. So now if we turn and face the army again, it'll drop back down to 53, 54, 55, something like that. But as we bring the camera down the army, as you can see, it doesn't really drop below 50, so I think DXVK has given us a noticeable improvement. Again, both in the amount of frames per second that we're getting, but also in the stability of those frames. All right, next we're going to run a 4 GB patcher on the 2 executables for Rome Total War. So first we need to go to this website here, and again, there'll be a link in the description, so you can just click on that if you'd prefer that. Right at the top here, we have the option to download the 4 GB patch, so let's do that. Once it's finished downloading, go ahead and open up your downloads folder, and then we're going to extract the executable. Again, I'm using 7-zip, but Windows definitely can extract the zip file without 7-zip, so you definitely don't need 7-zip for this at least. Now, like I said, we want to run it on the 2 executables that come with Rome Total War. So if I right-click and go to Run as Administrator, Now, it just so happens that the last folder, I guess, that I had ever used like this patcher on was actually the Rome Total War folder, so it actually brought me there on its own. Let's pretend that it didn't. Let's say it brought me to Star Wars Battlefront 2. Now, the way to get back to Rome Total War is to do what we did for DXVK. And actually, we've done this a few times. Just right-click on Rome Total War, go to Browse Local Files, and here is the location. So if we just click up here, and then right-click and copy, we can go right to the 4GB patcher, then right-click and paste up here, hit Enter on your keyboard, and now you'll be back at the Rome Total War folder again. So here's the two executables, Rome TW and Rome TW-BI. So I'm just going to click on this one first, and it'll be done basically in an instant. So just click on another file, and it should take you right back to the Rome Total War folder again. So double click on the Rome Total War-BI, and just like that, you're done. So hit OK. Now if I go back to the Rome Total War folder myself, you'll actually see that there's a couple of backup files here. This is so that if there is any problem with the two executables, now that they've been patched, you can go back to the original ones by using these two backup files instead. To be clear, I've literally never had to do that ever, but in case you need to, that's where they are. Now what the 4GB patcher does is it actually allows Rome Total War to use more than, I believe it's 2GB of RAM. It basically lets it use 4. Now, I have seen various discussions on this. Some have said that it doesn't really help at all. Basically, just because Rome Total War is able to use 4GB doesn't mean it will. I have no demonstration to show you, no examples to like show that you're going to get extra frames on a battlefield or anything like that. In fact, in-game, I don't really see any difference after I've used the 4GB patcher. Now, I still use it because I do believe it does help, not necessarily in giving you more frames or anything like that, but I do think that it helps prevent any like out-of-memory errors from occurring simply by allowing Rome to use more memory. Now, this sort of utility is actually used quite a lot if you're familiar with Medieval 2 mods. Basically, every single Medieval 2 mod that I've ever seen the description for, it says to use the 4GB patcher, but I hardly ever see that in Rome 1. In fact, I believe there's only one mod that I've seen that actually says to use it. But regardless, I think it's something to use. I've definitely used it in the last few campaigns myself. At the very least, I'll say it doesn't actually hurt anything, like it doesn't cause crashes. And I do believe it likely will prevent a crash or two if the crash was related to like being out of memory or something like that. The next thing I'd like to go over is how you can get more factions in this screen here apart from just the 3 starting ones, the Julii and the 2 Pretender factions. You see, in this game, the way it was expected for you to be able to play as other factions is you would have to defeat them as some other faction first. So if as the Julii you beat the Gauls, for example, the Gauls would then show up here as an option to play next time, and you would just have to kind of work your way around the map defeating factions before they would be unlocked for play here. But we don't need to do that. We can actually just adjust a text file. And of course, we actually do need to take a look at that text file anyways, because you may recall earlier in this video, when I was showing you the show error launch option, there seemed to be a problem with that file. So when I close the game, you remember this? Yeah, we need to go to that file and actually take a look at it. And actually, if you want to pause right here and take a note of this path, that's where we're about to go. I'll show you in a moment, but I'm going to go somewhat quickly. So there's the path right there. So to get to that path and to get to that file, just right-click on Rome Total War, go to Browse Local Files, as we have done many times now. Go to Data, go down to World, go to Maps, Campaign, Imperial Campaign, and there's the file, desker_strat. I'm just going to go ahead and open the file here. You don't need to scroll down at all. What we need to deal with is right here at the very top. As you can see, there appears to be a problem here. There seems to be another faction here that isn't part of the game, and it also is using spaces instead of underscores. You can see the other factions are using underscores here and here. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that, and I think that'll clear up our error. Now, while we're here, This is also where you would go to actually unlock some of those other factions. So if you wanted to play as Egypt, you can see there's this unlockable section here. It goes from this word unlockable to end right here. So you could, if you want, just go ahead and cut and paste Egypt right out of here and into the top part of the file. I always like to remove any spaces, line breaks, or anything that makes the file different from the way it was before. And I do that just because I don't want the file looking any different or causing any errors because like there's a formatting error or something. And so now if I were to save this and then go into the game, as you can see, I can now start the game as Egypt instead of one of the Roman factions. And now if I were to exit the game, did I fix that error by removing the Empire of the Sith? It would seem that I have. So now going back into the file, you don't have to just pick one faction, of course. You could, if you want, just go ahead and highlight all of these, right-click and cut, or use your keyboard shortcuts, and hit enter, and then right-click and paste, or again, use your keyboard shortcuts. And I'm just going to remove that space there between unlockable and end. Don't remove the entire section. I believe that will cause errors. And even if it doesn't, I don't like to remove entire sections. I want the sections to be the same with no spaces, line breaks, or anything like that, just to avoid any formatting errors. And so now if I enter the game, I should have all of these factions as well. And indeed I do. I have all of these other factions here to play as. But of course, you may have noticed in that file that there was actually another section with some additional factions down below. So let's go ahead and go back to the file and take a look at those. Going back into the desker_strat file, you can see that there's this entire other section down here with factions that have been marked as non-playable. Now it turns out you actually can play as most of these factions. In fact, if I highlight all of these here, cut and paste them up into the top, I'm making sure there's no like line breaks, extra spaces or anything, just removing all of that, I should be able to play as all of these factions as well if I save the file. And as you can see, I now have even more factions to play as. Now, the factions that came from the non-playable section, you may notice a few oddities here and there. For example, if I click on Spain here, it doesn't have a description. I believe if you start the campaign, it just uses the same cinematic as one of the other factions. I think it's the Gauls or something. You can still play as the faction. You won't get like crashes or anything like that. But just bear in mind that you might be like missing a description or just some information here and there, but the factions are playable. Now you may have noticed that there were two factions that I actually left down in the non-playable section, and that's the Slave faction and the Romans Senate faction. I believe you can actually play as these two, but I also believe there's some more work to do to get them to work, and I also believe there's like certain rules and conditions you have to keep in mind, and I think that's a bit beyond what I'm trying to cover here in this guide. But just be aware that I've left those two off there for that reason. So now it is time to move on to Barbarian Invasion. And actually you've done most of the work needed to get that up and running. Your launch options will already be good. Your DXVK is already set up. The 4GB patcher has been applied. There are a couple of things though that we do need to do to get that up and running. So first off, let's go ahead and go back to the Rome Total War folder again. Now, earlier I showed you that the Preferences folder here had your Preferences files and your controls here. Now, instead of resetting them up inside of Barbarian Invasion, you can actually just copy these two files over and have them basically set up for you. I'm just going to highlight both of those and right-click and copy, or use your keyboard shortcuts. Then I'm going to go back to the main folder, and you see there's a BI folder up here for Barbarian Invasion. And there's another Preferences folder here. Now, I have not started up Barbarian Invasion, and so it is empty. So I'm just going to right-click and paste to put the preferences and the controls in there. Now, if you've already started the Barbarian Invasions campaign, there will be files there, so just overwrite them if prompted to do so. And so now to go ahead and start the campaign, hit play, and this time select Launch Rome Total War Barbarian Invasion. And as you can see, the game has already started in full screen, so if we go to Options and we go to our video settings, all of our resolutions are correct, and all of our settings are as they were in the base game. If I go to my control settings, the case is the same. You didn't have to reset all of those up in the game. And again, DXVK, the 4GB patch, all of that is already set up as well. So Barbarian Invasion is basically set up at this point, but let me just show you one more thing. You see, Barbarian Invasion also has its own desker_strat file. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at that. Now go back into that BI folder, go to Data, go down to World, go to Maps, go to Campaign, and then Barbarian Invasion. And if I open up the Desker_strat file here, you can see it has its own section of playable, unlockable, and non-playable factions. Now, I've actually already adjusted this file. When you first open this file, it'll look different from this. Many of these factions here will actually be down here in the non-playable section. The unlockable section was actually already blank. Now, these are all the factions that you should be able to play as without having to do any adjustments or anything, but you'll notice I have left behind a few factions down here. Now, I believe you can play as these factions, but they require some additional adjustment to the game. And I think that's a bit beyond the scope of this video, but in the description down below, I'll link you to a few videos from To Nerd is to Human. He has done some guides on getting these factions up and running, so you can go ahead and watch those. Something I almost forgot to mention, if you do want to set up frame limiting or Vsync on Barbarian Invasion, that is a separate executable, so you will have to come back to whatever solution you chose before to go ahead and set that up for Barbarian Invasion. The procedure would be the same, it's just that instead of selecting the ROM.tw file here, you would select the ROM.tw-bi file instead. Now, unfortunately, if you want to play the Alexander campaign, you are going to have to redo a fair bit of what we've done here, and that's because it's actually a separate install over here in Steam. With that being said, there are some shortcuts we can take, so I'm actually just going to blaze through the setup of Alexander really quickly here, and remember that you can slow me down, speed me up, whatever you want in the YouTube settings, because I am just going to kind of just go through this as quickly as we can. It's basically redoing what we've already done, but for Alexander, with a couple of shortcuts. So first off, let's click on Alexander and get it installed. Once Alexander is installed, let's go ahead and right-click on it and go to Properties. Let's disable the Steam overlay if it's enabled, and we'll add the same two launch options as we did for the base game and for Barbarian Invasion, -NE space -show_ERR. The next thing to do would be to set up our preferences, and we can actually go ahead and copy over the preferences files from the base game so that we don't have to reset them up in the game. Let's go back to that preferences folder again, highlight preferences and keys, and let's copy those. Then I'm going to right-click on Alexander and go to its folder instead. Now, the preferences folder isn't here, and it's actually not here either when you double-click on Alexander, but this is where it would be if you had started the game. So either start the game so that it creates the folder for you, or you can just create the folder yourself. Once the folder is there, just go right into it and paste those files in there. Now, if you let the game create the folder for you, you will have to overwrite the files that are already there. Just replace them when prompted. Now, if you're going to set up Vsync or frame limiting, you will, once again, whatever option you chose, you will need to set it up for Alexander. I'm just going to close out of here really quick. Alexander actually does have two executables, just like the base game does, but they're not like two separate campaigns. You have ROM.tw-ALX right there, and then you have test, I'm going to say appa.exe right there. Now, when I start the game, usually it's the test one that actually gets used, and I'm not entirely sure what this one is actually for. I'm going to say, if it's here, it must have some kind of purpose. It might even just be a copy of the test appa file, if I'm being honest. It has the same size and everything. But I would say go ahead and apply your Vsync or frame limiting options to both of those, just to make sure you're covered no matter which file it ends up using. Now we need to go ahead and set up DXVK. You actually don't need to go back to your downloads folder. You can actually go ahead and go right into the Rome Total War folder. And you can see the two D3D files are here at the top, so let's just go ahead and right-click and copy those. Then we'll go to the install folder for Alexander, and then you can just paste them right in here. And just like that, DXVK is already set up. Now we're going to set up the 4 GB patch. If you go right back to your downloads folder, you should still have it here. If you don't, then just go ahead and re-download it using the information that I provided earlier in this video. Let's just go ahead and right-click and run as administrator. And again, you can do what we did earlier in the video. just right-click on Alexander and go to Browse Local Files, and you'll have the path right up here. So right-click and copy, then go back to the patcher and right-click and paste up here. Hit Enter on your keyboard, and now you're in the Alexander folder. So again, the game may use one of these, it may use the other, so let's just do both. We'll do romtw-alx first, then we'll click another file, and we'll do the same with test APA. And then hit OK when you're done. And as you can see, there are now backup files right next to the regular files here in the Alexander folder. And just like that, Rome Total War Alexander should now be set up. So if you go into the game, go into your options and your video settings, everything should be as it was in Barbarian Invasion and in the base game. And if you go to your control settings, you can see those are all the same as well. And of course, again, DXVK and all that is also already set up for you. Now, if you saw the short version of this guide, we've essentially covered everything that we did in that short guide, but with the additional explanations and showing off some examples and things. But now we're going to get into stuff that we definitely did not cover in the short guide. The first thing we will cover is Reshade. To get Reshade set up, we need to go to the website, reshade.me, and I'll have a link for that website in the description down below, so you can just click on that if you want. Now at the Reshade website, you'll want to scroll all the way down. You can see there's a download Reshade 6.4.1 option there. Now, like with DXVK, Reshade is updated somewhat regularly, so just use whatever the latest version is. Honestly, I've never had to go back to an older version to get it working with the game, so just try the latest version. Once Reshade is finished downloading, you should have this executable here in your Downloads folder, so just right-click on it and run as administrator. Now basically we need to point it to our Rome Total War install folder, or rather to the executables that are in it. So let's go ahead and get that location as we've done previously in this guide. Just browse to local files. And here it is up here, so right-click and copy. Go back to Reshade. Hit browse here. Then right-click and paste it up here. Yes, I was already at that folder, but when you click browse, it probably won't take you there. It'll take you somewhere else. So that's an easy way to get to Rome Total War's install folder. And you can select either one of these two files here at the bottom, RomeTW or RomeTW-BI, whichever you please. And hit next. Now you get this little error pop up telling you basically that Rome Total War uses DirectX 8, which is accurate, which is true. However, you may recall earlier in this guide, I told you that DXVK had two uses. The first one was improving the frame rate in the game, but the other is actually going to help us here now. I'm going to just click OK through this message. You see, Reshade is not compatible with DirectX 8 games. You have to use either DirectX 9, 10, 11, or 12. However, DXVK is actually a converter, and it converts to Vulkan, which is this option down here. So make sure you just highlight Vulkan and hit Next. Now on this screen here, you either have to choose which effects you want to use, or you'll need a preset. Now to be clear, if you don't have a preset, you're going to have to do some experimenting, either with just these two sets of effects that have been checked off, or check off as many of these as you want. And then in-game, you'll have to choose which ones you want to turn on with Reshade. That's definitely well beyond the scope of this video. Basically, I actually have a preset already set up, so I'm going to click Browse. I'm going to go to my Rome Total War install folder, again using the same method that we've used many times now in this guide. Now, I actually have this preset here. I've already copied and pasted it into the Rome Total War install folder. I actually don't think it has to sit inside of the install folder, but I like to keep everything all in one place, so I usually throw in my Reshade preset in the same install folder where the game itself is located. I'll also leave a link in the description to this preset here if anyone wants to use it. Now, once you've selected your preset, either mine or if you've downloaded a different one, what should happen is you'll see that it'll actually just check off some of the effects here in Reshade. So instead of having to select everything yourself, basically this will automatically just choose everything that's related to the preset, all of the different effects that are in that preset, and then you won't have to download anything else. So then click Next. And if you're using my preset, it should be done very quickly because it's a very small, very simple preset. Depending on how many effects you have to download, it might take a bit. Then click Finish. And just to clarify something, you don't need to install Reshade separately for Barbarian Invasion or for the original campaign, depending on which executable you picked during the Reshade setup. When I told you that it didn't matter which one you chose, I really meant that. Once you've installed Reshade into this directory, it will work with either the original Grand Campaign or it'll work with Barbarian Invasion, regardless of which of these executables you chose during the install. It will work with both of them. Of course, Rome Total War Alexander is in its own separate install directory, so we do need to set it up again for Alexander if you intend on playing that campaign. So once again, just right-click, Run as Administrator, go to Browse, then we'll need the directory, the install directory for Rome Total War Alexander. So I'll just right-click and copy that there, bring Reshade back up, right-click and paste it in there, enter on the keyboard, and once again, it doesn't matter which of these executables you choose, it'll work for both of them once it's installed. Next, you'll get the same error. For the same reason, we will ignore it and just click on Vulkan. I'm going to click Browse because once again, I've actually already copied my Reshade preset into the Rome Total War Alexander folder, so I'm just going to select that. It's the same one that I use for the base game and for Barbarian Invasion. Next, wait just a moment for it to finish, and then click Finish. And now I have Reshade set up in Rome Total War Alexander, just like I do in the base game and Barbarian Invasion. And basically, we're done installing Reshade, though there is some additional configuration you would want to do in-game. Now, as you can see, I fired up the game here, and Reshade has been installed successfully, which is great, but it's also telling me that I need to press home to start the tutorial. Now, I don't need the tutorial myself, so I am just going to go ahead and hit skip here. To be honest, if you're using a preset, you probably don't need to configure really anything here at all, though I will just quickly show you what I do when setting up Reshade. First, I go into Settings, then I change my overlay and effect keys. You, again, do not have to change these to the ones I'm changing them to. That's just my personal preference. I do check this box here that says Load Only Enabled Effects, just in case there's extra effects here on my computer or in my install. And then just for my own personal preference, I do like to have the dark theme for Reshade. Again, you don't have to do any of that if you don't want to. Then I come down here and I check the box for Performance Mode. To be honest, I don't think it affects Rome Total War very much, but I always check that box once I'm done configuring everything, just so that Reshade has minimal impact on the game, or at least as minimal an impact as I can possibly make it. Again, I don't think it affects Rome Total War too much. Specifically, I don't think it negatively affects Rome Total War. I've actually gotten quite a positive boost from Reshade and the preset that I'm using. If you look in the top right here, you can see that I've actually got 72, 73 frames per second. Yes, obviously, we're on the same custom battle as before, same army, same everything. Just that now we've got Reshade. Before we were getting 64, 65, now we're getting about 72, 73. So now let's turn around and face the army. Last time we were getting 54, 55 frames per second, or no, it was 55, 56 frames per second. Remember, we got an extra couple of frames after we put in DXVK. So now if we turn around, what happens? It certainly does drop, but it dropped to 62, which is an improvement over 55. I think basically we're getting anywhere from 5 to 7 frame improvement. And that improvement actually does stick around if I put my camera down here. Last time we were getting about 50, 51 frames per second. I think we were right about here, I'd say. And now if you look in the top right, as you can see, we are getting 57, 56, 57, 58 or so frames per second. So an improvement of about 5 to 7 frames. Now you may be wondering, how is Reshade actually improving the frames per second? Because normally I would expect sticking some extra effects on the game would actually cause frames per second to lower, not increase. I was curious about that myself, so let's put the camera back over here staring at that blank field again. So there we are, back up to like 72, 73 frames per second. And now if I open the Reshade interface here, I'm actually going to disable all of the effects and then remove the interface. And if we give it just a moment, as you can see, my frames per second have actually dropped back down to what it was before, 64, 65, it was 63 there for just a moment. Interestingly enough, even just opening up the Reshade interface does seem to give me a couple of extra frames for some reason. But specifically, what seems to give me the most frames is actually this effect right here. If I turn on Immerse, and then I'm going to get rid of the interface here, you can see the frames per second have actually gone up back to 73. Now, I'm not entirely sure why that works or how that works. If I open up the interface again, and I hover my mouse over it, this is just a catch-all setup shader that prepares various data for other effects. Specifically, it's, I believe, a requirement for these other three effects down here, the anti-aliasing, MXAO, and sharpen effects. But I guess whatever preparation it seems to do is it actually improves the frames per second for some reason. Because if I turn on all the rest of these, it doesn't like drop or anything, and then I'll just remove the interface. As you can see, that even with all those on, it goes up to 73. Of course, the reason people usually set up Reshade is actually for the visual improvement rather than for the game's performance. That was just an extra lucky benefit that I didn't even know I was going to get from this preset. But basically, currently what we've got here is Reshade is actually turned off, or at least all the effects are off. And so this is what the game looks like without the preset, and I really hope that YouTube doesn't butcher this video too much so you guys can see the visual improvement yourselves. Basically, I hit a key to turn all the effects on. What I really noticed the most is just how much darker everything is, especially like the shadows are deeper, and there's extra shadows, I think, too, where there previously wasn't. And the image just overall looks a lot sharper. And if I put the camera here in front of the pikemen, this is with Reshade turned off, and this is with Reshade turned on. Again, sharper image, darker shadows, and I think a bit more shadow too. And just one more example, we have our general and his bodyguard here. This is with Reshade turned off, and this is with Reshade turned on. Now for the last improvement, we have a program called Lossless Scaling. If you hear me say lossless gaming at any point in the rest of the video, I'm actually referring to this program here. For some reason in my head, I keep thinking it's lossless gaming instead of lossless scaling, but it's this program. This is the one we're looking for. Now, this is the paid for program that I mentioned. Honestly, even when it's not on sale, it's like $7, so that's not too bad. But this program is definitely worth it. And as you can see, you buy it right through Steam, and you can run it right from your Steam library. Once you do start it up in Steam once, though, you can also just create a shortcut directly to the executable if you prefer that. So once you've got it purchased, downloaded, and installed, it'll show up like any program in Steam, so you can just go ahead and launch it right from Steam. Again, or you can create that shortcut, like I mentioned before. Here are the settings that I used for Rome Total War. I'm just going to slowly kind of scroll down here so you guys can get a good look at all of the settings. I believe most of them are at the default, and I will go through them here in just a moment either way. I actually needed to familiarize myself with it anyways, because the program actually had a significant update, and part of it was the UI has completely changed. So I had to actually take a look at it myself and make sure I understood how everything worked. Now, the first thing I would like to point out is that scaling is actually turned off. Despite the program's name being Lossless Scaling, I'm actually not using the scaling option at all. That isn't to say that it isn't necessarily useful. It's just that I was already getting such good frames, and frame generation in particular was also making things quite nice, so I just felt like I didn't need any scaling options turned on as well, but definitely feel free to experiment with those if you want. Let me know in the comments down below if you have any interesting findings. But the main reason we're using the program today is for frame generation. And again, these are the settings that I used for my campaign. Now, I am using fixed, though to be fair, that is only because the adaptive option didn't actually exist when I did my campaign. This program was actually updated fairly recently, and the very last update actually added adaptive frame generation, as you can see there. In future games, I think I will actually test that out. In fact, I think we're going to test it out as part of this video. But at least for my campaign, the one that I ran, these are the settings here. Now, if we scroll down here to rendering, I do have Vsync turned on, as you can see, and this is another way you can get Vsync in the game. Earlier, I mentioned using NVIDIA's control panel or the app or the scanline sync in RivaTuner. This is yet another way that you could use Vsync, and this is the one that I actually ended up using. For the moment, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it off, and that's because we've been testing up to this point with no Vsync turned on, no frame limiting or anything. We just or letting Rome Total War give us as many frames as it's got. And that's what we're going to continue to do until a little later on when I go ahead and start limiting frames again. I also do have Draw FPS turned on, and that's going to give us a little counter up in the top left corner of our screen of Rome Total War. That'll show us not just the frames that the game is generating, but also the frames that lossless scaling is generating. Now, there is another set of settings that I would like to bring to your attention. Let's go to the program's install folder, the same way we did with Rome Total War, just by browsing to local files. Then if you scroll down, there's a config.ini file right here. If you open it up in Notepad, I'm actually going to ignore all the top bits here. The only one that I really care about right now, the only thing that I changed anyways, is the FPS counter. Now, the default one uses white text. It's pretty small, and it's just really hard to see, especially if like you end up on a snowy map or anything. It's just really hard to see. So what I've done is I've just doubled it in size and made it red. Those definitely aren't going to be my permanent settings. I need to do some more serious experimentation with it later on, but I might even use like a different font. But for now, this should make it nice and visible for us. And just letting you know so that if you guys want to run the FPS counter yourself, you know where to go ahead and change these options. All right, so here we are back at our custom battle again. Lossless scaling is enabled, and you can actually see it up here on the top left. Now, the left-hand number is the actual frames that the game is generating, so it should basically be the same as RivaTuner statistics over here on the right. Now, the number on just to the right of it there is actually the frame rate that we are getting due to lossless scaling, inserting those frames through frame generation. Now, it is worth mentioning, this footage is being recorded at 60 frames per second, so you guys aren't going to get the full glory of that frame rate. And actually, even my monitor doesn't go that high. It actually only goes up to 120, so I'm not seeing all of those frames either. But I don't necessarily have a whole lot to show you, because basically, since lossless scaling is using fixed mode at double the frame rate, basically this number should always be double whatever this number is, or at least very close to it. It might be off by like a frame or two. So doing the same test as before, like turning my camera around, basically the frame drops to what it was before, but now we're getting again those extra frames due to lossless scaling. And if I move the camera down here, again, you guys aren't really going to be able to see very much here. You just have to take my word for it that things are smoother and the camera looks better and everything. Though there actually is one place where I could actually definitely show you guys a difference. One place where the frames are usually terrible no matter what. And let's see what lossless scaling can do for us. Alright, so here we are. I have loaded up my Seleucid Empire campaign, the one that I keep going on about, that I tested all this stuff on. Basically, I'm sitting here at Rome, and as you can see, I've got about 80 frames per second right now in the top right. So now, I'm just going to move my camera to the east, and you can just watch as the frames disappear. And the game becomes very, very stuttery, of course, here in the middle. Now, an interesting thing that I would like to point out is that the frames appear to be tied not to camera movement, but to the movement keys. And I guess what I mean by that is right now, as you can see, we've got about 80 frames per second, right? And it's just as I start moving that the frames go down, and then when I let go of the keys, the frames go back up. But even if the camera isn't moving, the frames will still stay down. So I'm just going to go as far to the east as I can until I hit the border. And as you can see, even though the camera is not moving, the frames are still at 29. And that's because I'm still holding down the key to go to the right. If I let go of that key, then the frames go back up. Yeah, just thought I'd point that out. But anyway, as you can see, it's rather jittery, and it's not very pleasant to look at. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn on lossless scaling. As you can see, I now have my counter up there on the top left. Now remember, I have it fixed at double the frame rate. So it's not going to fix the frames per se. They are still going to drop. It's just that I'm hoping the resulting frames are better than what we were getting before. So I now head to the right. I really hope this is showing up really well on YouTube, because it actually looks a lot better than it did without lossless scaling. I do see what looks like screen tearing in parts, but remember, I do have Vsync turned off specifically because I didn't want any Vsync, no frame limiting of any kind. we'll do that. We'll handle that in a bit. I just want to see what frames we can get with no limitations right now. Now I'm going to go ahead and just turn it off again, just to show you, again, that's what it looked like without lossless scaling. And as I head back, that's what it looks like with it turned on. It's definitely not perfect, but again, I think it looks a hell of a lot better. Now, that was the setting that I used during my actual campaign, but there was another setting that I mentioned, and I actually have done a bit of testing with it. So let's go ahead and first off turn off lossless scaling, and then I'm going to Alt-Tab out so that I can bring up the program again. Now, I mentioned in this last version they actually added an adaptive mode here. This version came out after my campaign, so I didn't use it during the campaign, but I have done a bit of testing. I'm actually going to turn it on. And the way this mode works is it actually tries to give you a consistent frame rate regardless of what your in-game frame rate is. So instead of just doubling whatever your frame rate is, it always tries to hit this target here. I'm going to leave it at 120 because that's what my monitor can basically display. I did also notice this here, and it says that you can actually adjust this flow scale, and it recommends putting it at 75% if you're at 1440p, which is what I'm using. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. We'll minimize that, and we'll go back into the game. Now, once again, just to give your eyes another taste of it, that's what it looks like without lossless scaling. And this is what it looks like with it. As you can see, it's actually hitting the 120 frame mark actually quite well. It's only slightly dipping here and there. I think I've lost 4 frames at one point. I saw it drop to 116 at one point. Now there is, I think, a fair bit of screen tearing when I do this, so it might be worth turning Vsync on. In fact, let's go ahead and turn lossless scaling off, Alt-Tab out, and go back to the program again. Now, like I said, I did actually have Vsync turned on during the campaign, and I had this option specifically set rather than default. Having read through the options, though, I'm actually going to go ahead and try it just at default. So then let's go ahead and get back into the game. Once again, this is how it looks without lossless scaling. And this is how it looks with it. And actually, I do not see the screen tearing anymore, so that is good. The only problem I think that I really see is there's occasional shimmering and flickering on some of the textures, though it is very minor. The only constant shimmer that I see is actually just above the interface here. Like if you look above the stonework down here that represents the UI, if I move the camera, you can see shimmering. I don't know if you guys can see it on YouTube, but I can definitely see it here in-game. Now, to be clear, do I care? Not really. This is so much better than with it turned off, because here, I'll turn it off again. And here's the jitteriness. And then I turn it back on, and it is much smoother. And I'm perfectly happy with having like a bit of flicker here and a bit of shimmer down here, if that's what it means to have this nice, smooth experience here. And remember, you're not seeing it in its full glory because the footage is at 60 frames per second. It is not actually hitting the 115, 118, 120 that I'm seeing. Again, it would look a heck of a lot better if you downloaded it and did it yourself, though I hope that in the footage at least, it still looks at least better than it did before. All right, and so here we are back outside of Rome Total War and back into the software again, lossless scaling. And these are basically the final settings. Like if I were to start a campaign right now, these would probably be the ones that I would test it at. Though just as a reminder, for my actual campaign, I had this set to Vsync, I had this set to fixed, and I had the flow scale set all the way up, and the multiplier was at 2. And I think you would have a good time using those settings too, but now that they've added this adaptive frame setting, I think I would try that. Especially on the campaign map, it looked better, but I think it'll look good on the battle map as well. And again, setting default here as I had it a moment ago. Also, as a quick reminder, or maybe this is the first time I'm saying it, I feel like I said it before, but maybe I didn't. If you're using this sync setting here, you don't need to set it anywhere else. So earlier when I was showing you the NVIDIA app, the NVIDIA control panel, and showing you like where the Vsync options were, you don't need to use those. In fact, you should turn those off and use this option here. if you're using lossless scaling. If you've decided not to buy the program and you're just going to use what you've got, then go ahead and set Vsync in NVIDIA app or the NVIDIA control panel, or if you don't have an NVIDIA graphics card, using whatever software you want to use. Now, there is one more thing that I want to change, and it is actually related to frame limiting, and that's going back to RivaTuner statistics server. Now, in all this testing, we've definitely gotten it up to some good frames, but I do have one more concern about the stability. You may recall while we were doing our testing, we would look at that open field and it would be like 73 frames per second, and then I'd look behind me at the army and it would be 55, and then I would, dive in amongst the troops and it would drop like a little bit, maybe it would be like 53 or something. It kind of depended, but the frames were a little bit all over the place. None of those frames were bad, but again, I don't want them to jump around that much, because that's like a 20 frame drop if it goes from 73 to 53, or 55, it's pretty close. So what I want to do is now limit my frames to what I think Rome Total War could actually hit most of the time. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be right on the money, but as long as most of the time Rome Total War can hit that frame rate, then that should be fine. Now, to be clear, Vsync would normally be able to do something like that on its own, but my monitor is set to 120 Hz, so I get 120 FPS, and Rome is never going to hit that on its own. Again, we were only able to get those high frame rates because lossless scaling was allowing us to do that. RivaTuner, however, is just affecting the game's own FPS, like the number that is given to lossless scaling for it to then increase, if that makes sense. So having looked at all the different frame rates, I'm actually going to go ahead and set mine to 60 frames per second. So what should happen is, without lossless scaling, I should be able to usually hit 60 frames per second in Rome Total War, and then lossless scaling can take that and hopefully put it up to 120, again, most of the time. There might be a little jitteriness here and there, but if it's just a couple of frames, just a few frames, and only occasionally, then the game should look very stable and look very good. Now, you don't have to use RivaTuner statistics server, and again, maybe I'm belaboring this point, but you can also set your frame limit in NVIDIA app, NVIDIA control panel, or whatever your graphics card control panel is. But I'm using RivaTuner statistics server for this video. And so now, to close out the video, we're going to have one final test of everything, and it's going to be a proper test with a battle and everything. So we're getting 60 FPS facing a blank field. And again, that's probably because Riva is limiting the frames to 60 frames. Otherwise, we'd probably be getting that 70. But we don't want to drop up and go down, up and down, up and down. So that's why I've limited it to 60. So now if I turn around and face my army, again, still 60 frames per second. Now, I am expecting there to be a drop as I put my camera amongst the troops here. The goal, however, is not to have no drop at all. I mean, that would be nice, of course, but I just want the drop, if there is any, to be very minimal. I think right about there is where the camera usually is. And as you can see, we've lost 3 frames by the look of it. Sometimes, yeah, 2-3 frames, basically. That's fine. That's perfect. We won't see some huge stutter as it goes from a much higher frame rate to a much lower one. In fact, I guess what I should probably do is also just have my camera swoop in over the army. Again, watching that frame rate in the top right. And as you can see, it never dropped below 57. All right, fantastic. And again, this is without lossless scaling. As you can see, there's no counter up there on the top left. So if you chose not to get that program, even now, you should be able to have a nice, good, stable frame rate, a nice high frame rate, and the game should run quite well. I'm now going to turn on lossless scaling. And I know I'm probably belaboring this point as well, but this video footage is at 60 frames per second, so you probably won't notice any improvement, but I assure you there is. I can see it myself as I move my camera around here. And so now with everything turned on and, the game fully set up, and oh yes, I forgot to mention, or almost forgot to mention, I actually even updated DXVK. So remember earlier when I said that there was an update in between the recording sessions? Well, now I've updated DXVK to version 2.6. So we're using that latest version. So let's go ahead now and finish off with the battle here. Let's bring the enemy onto the battlefield. As you can see, we did dip there for just a couple of frames. 59. I saw it go to 58 at one point. Now, something I just realized that I did that I should probably fix is I'm just going to have my elephants and my cavalry, I should say, pull back. Not really part of the front battle line. I kind of want them on the side here. Oh, shoot. I moved them a little too far. You guys get over here. Cavalry, get back here. And that's just so that the infantry doesn't come, like, charging directly into them. In fact, I think you guys could stand to be a little further back. I want my elephants as much as possible to be a flanking force, and that's hard to do if they're actually part of the front line. Now, the phalanx should be pretty much invulnerable from the front, especially against our enemy, which I should actually probably mention is literally 20 Britannic warbands. Now, if you're wondering why, to be honest, I didn't actually plan on having this battle at the end of the video. I just sort of decided to have it. And I was testing with large armies that had like 20 units in them, and they were all with men that had, or units that had 240 men in them. Just to have as many men on the battlefield as possible to stress out the computer as much as possible. Because this is actually quite a huge battle. We've got 20 units on both sides. Not all of my units are as big as they could be, obviously. The elephants, the archers, and the cavalry are a bit small. But even so, this is actually quite a large battle, and yet the frames are reasonably stable. I did see it go down to 57 again. I might have gone lower at one point. I thought I saw it flicker at one point, but I wasn't paying necessarily close enough attention. But again, very nice, very stable. All right, so now the enemy approaches. We have archers behind the phalanx who will take some shots, of course. What we'll need to do is have the elephants and the cavalry basically break their flanks. One thing I noticed in the campaign is that elephants are rather cowardly units. They do run amok or break and run very easily if they're unsupported. So that's why I have cavalry just behind them. Basically, the elephants charge first, and then the cavalry charges in right behind them. And it usually keeps their morale nice and high. I'm going to tell my archers to stop firing already. I know they barely got off a shot, but I don't want my guys to get shot in the back. So again, we'll have the elephants charge in here, but we'll have the cavalry right next to them. Okay, let's bring the general over there to keep up their morale. Of course, the war bands are going to rout pretty quickly, I think. Get the general over here to keep them nice and happy. You guys, get over here and charge into them. Again, to keep the elephants happy. You guys, charge into them now. Oh dear. The cavalry is not doing well. I was hoping to keep them from... keep the enemy from rallying, but clearly that's not going to happen. So, anyway, keep charging my elephants and my cavalry. General, stay with them. The Greek cavalry are not the best cavalry unit, if I'm honest, so they are taking a fair amount of casualties over here. Let's see, let's also push our infantry line forward. Just to make sure that the enemy doesn't forget about them. Okay, go on, get over there. In fact, let's commit the general over there as well. All right, we are going to keep the archers at least somewhat behind our troops over there, just so that they don't get outflanked. You guys fire on them there. Cavalry pull back. Oh, you see, the enemy is rallying over here. Get these guys charging over here. You guys pull back over there. All right, some of our infantry have engaged them here on the front.
The enemy general is killed. Fear makes a hole.
Okay, you guys now charge into them. All right, we're just going to have to play game with these guys here. Let's have this infantry pull out of their phalanx and get back over here to protect the archers, because the archers are going to need it. This cavalry get over here. Now let's have at least one of the elephant units get back over here. Okay, and actually let's have these cavalry units get back over here as well. Okay, what are you guys doing? All right, continue your pursuit of the enemy. Oh, actually, go get those guys. You guys can go get them as well. So you two archer units fire on them. You guys reassume your phalanx. Okay, good. They have so many infantry units that they're able to kind of surround us pretty effectively, too. All right, you guys push forward and make sure they don't do anything silly. All of you charge right in there. We've only lost one elephant so far, so the cavalry has supported them well. Okay, you guys reform over here. Actually, let's reform the entire line in this direction. Oh, and with that, we are victorious. So let's get our cavalry out there to run down the stragglers. You guys go ahead and chase after them. General, why don't you get over here and chase them? The elephants aren't particularly good at chasing down enemies, so we'll just kind of have them sit over here. The archers aren't firing at anyone. That's good, because they would probably just hit our own guys. Actually, you guys, the elephants can just stop wherever they are. Now, I will admit something. Obviously, I've been paying pretty close attention to the battle and not to the frame rate in the top right or the top left. So I'm just going to see when I edit the footage later how it looks. Maybe you guys were watching more closely than I was, and you can see how things looked. I've been paying closer attention now that the battle is basically over, but with the battle basically being over, a lot of the enemy are also dead, so that's going to mean that there's less units to tug on our frame rate. And yes, my speech capabilities have dropped considerably because I've been having to pay attention to the battlefield, so if there have been some long pauses where it seems like I'm lost in thought, it's because I kind of am. Okay, let's see. Looking at the map up here, I don't think there's any other enemies. Oh, wait, there is someone here. There's 3 guys there. Okay, shoot them. They shouldn't hit any of our own guys. Shouldn't. Cavalry, get over here. Finish off these guys. Should I go get those guys, please? Yep, there's now just one guy left, and he's dead. Alright, go get those guys. And yes, this is how I fight my battles. I always fight them to the end, even though there was a message telling me that I won the battle and I could just end it right there and then. Nope, that's not how this works. I consider chasing down the enemy to be part of the battle. I guess technically we're also doing a test, but I think at this point it's fair to say that with so few troops on the battlefield, now that most of the enemy are dead, our frames should be fine regardless. Again, I'll check it in post and see if we dropped significantly at any point, but I guess I didn't notice any significant drops while I was directing the troops.
The enemy are utterly beaten. This is a crushing victory worthy of a great general.
All right, and there we have it. Look at the final statistics here. Obviously, the cavalry did an immense amount of damage, and the elephants kind of did too. Well, I say kind of. The elephants did very well, but remember, the cavalry's casualties inflicted will always be much higher because they ran down all of the enemy who routed. And this list includes enemies who routed and died fleeing, not just the enemies who fought and died. Whereas I don't think the elephants killed many men who fled. The archers actually killed a fair number. Probably when I had them running away from the warband who had managed to get around our line. This is Lord Calvarium, the editor, inserting myself basically into the video here. I've gone over most of my footage here, and there are a couple of things that I wanted to make clear that I don't think I really made clear in the rest of the video. I did the testing on this plain grass field purely for testing. I do realize that in an actual campaign and different battles, you'll never really fight one on just a plain grass field. Most battles will have at least some trees, and of course there are city battles. And so your FPS is not necessarily going to be as good as it was here in this video on those battlefields. Of course, your computer will also be different from mine, different specs, different drivers, graphics cards, whatever. And so your FPS could just be worse even on the same battlefield than mine, or it could perhaps be even better. During my Seleucid Empire campaign, I did have somewhat variable FPS depending on the battlefield. I would say that most battlefields, most of the time, I was able to get that 60 FPS, and then later in the campaign when I introduced lossless scaling and started using its frame generation, I would have had, again, mostly 120 FPS from that frame generation. That being said, once again, your frames could vary depending upon the battlefield and the troops, and a number of other factors that we didn't necessarily test for on this plain grass field. For example, I'm showing you some footage now from the Battle of Capua. In that battle, it was at a large city, or at least it had large stone walls. It was about 2,600 troops on my side and about 1,200 Romans on the other. And I'm showing you now the beginning of the battle where I'm still outside of the walls of the city. Catapults are firing and the sat points are taking out bits of the wall, and you'll notice my FPS drops actually a fair bit, like down into the 40s. And while it does clear up later in the battle, that presumably would be because there's now fewer and fewer troops on the battlefield, and so the FPS is just improving. And that's not just because of dead Romans, but also because I didn't bring all of my troops to the center of the settlement to finish the battle, so there would also have been less troops on my side. But then you consider this other battle, the Battle of Carthage that I'm showing you now. I had about the same number of troops on my side, about 2,600, and the Romans had about 900. So not as many as at Capua, but about 3/4 of what they had at Capua. And you'll notice just sitting outside of the settlement, I'm actually getting much better frame rates. Now, is that because the city is much smaller, the walls are much smaller, there's fewer troops obviously, though 3/4 as many as at Capua, so not a tiny number of troops. But do you see what I mean, that your frame rate can vary very much depending upon the battlefield and depending upon the number of soldiers on each side. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. Basically, you could just copy and paste exactly what I did, set up the settings exactly as I did, and it might work just fine for you. But the point of showing how I set things up was not just so that you could copy it exactly. I mean, you could, maybe as a starting point, but then depending on your preferences, you would then adjust things from there. In my case, my goal was basically to try and get to 120 FPS. First by making the game as stable and with as much FPS as I could make it, and then using lossless scaling to make up for the rest of it, to get up to that 120 FPS. And because I was experimenting and testing so much, that's why I was willing to accept that in at least some battles, I would have lower frame rate, even though, again, I think in most battles, most of the time, I was at 60 FPS and had the 120 FPS added by frame generation and lossless scaling. But if you don't care to push it that high, to 120, you could do even less if you wanted to. Maybe you could limit your frames to 45 frames per second instead of 60, and then you could use lossless scaling to either double that to 90, or you could try that adaptive mode that I pointed out and maybe try and still get it up to 120 anyways. Or maybe you just don't care about getting it up to 120 at all. Maybe you just want it to be a nice stable 60. So you don't use lossless scaling at all, and you just use RivaTuner or your graphics card control panel to just limit it to 60 and accept, a drop here or there. Or maybe you don't want to accept a drop at all. Maybe you limit your frames to, 30. using RivaTuner or your graphics card's control panel, and then use lossless scaling to bring it up to 60, and that would probably be very stable as well. The point of all these examples is, now that I've shown you how to do it, you can kind of do what you want instead of just copying what I did. Again, maybe copying what I did as a starting point, but then adjusting things for your personal preference, like what FPS do you want to hit? What do you consider an acceptable drop, if any? You just want it to be as stable as possible. Again, it's all up to you. All right, and that's all I wanted to say, so now I'm going to turn things over back to my past self. All right, but anyway, that's it. There's no more changes to make, no further tests to have, so I hope this has helped you out and will get Rome Total War running very well for you. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in any of my future videos. I have many more guides that I want to make, and probably some reviews of different games as well, but again, thank you for watching this video.